The cruelest thing a man can do is mistake a quiet woman for an empty one. On the 42nd floor of a Manhattan tower, where the windows held the city like a sheet of cold glass, and the dining table reflected every light in the room, Grant Whitmore ended his marriage with the same calm precision he used in board meetings. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Men like Grant had learned that disappointment sounded more powerful when spoken softly. Naomi sat across from him in a simple dark dress, her hands folded in her lap, her wedding ring catching the warm glow from the chandelier above them. Between them lay a fountain pen, a stack of legal papers, and the kind of silence that only existed after too many unsaid things had hardened into fact. Grant slid the papers an inch closer and said, almost gently, "You were never enough for my world." The words landed without a crash, but they changed the air in the room. Naomi did not blink right away. She just looked at the signature line as if it belonged to somebody else's life. Outside, a siren wailed somewhere far below, then faded into the night. Inside, the only sound was the low hum of the climate control and Grant's cuff links brushing the edge of the table when he leaned back. He had built an empire on certainty, on quick judgments, on deciding what belonged and what did not. And somewhere along the way, he had decided his wife belonged in the category of things that were polite, forgettable, and easy to replace. Naomi had always been the quiet one at charity galas, the one who stood half a step behind him in photographs, the one who listened more than she spoke when investors and politicians crowded their penthouse with expensive smiles. Grant had mistaken her restraint for weakness. He had mistaken her grace for passivity. He had mistaken her silence for the absence of depth. "You deserve someone louder," Naomi said at last, her voice so steady it almost unsettled him. Grant gave a thin smile, relieved that she was making this simple. "I deserve someone who can stand beside me," he said. Naomi looked up then, and for a split second something unreadable passed through her eyes, not hurt exactly, and not anger, but the quiet closing of a door. She reached for the pen. Her fingers were elegant, controlled, unhurried. She signed where he had marked the page with a gold tab. Then she slipped off her ring and placed it on top of the papers with a soft metallic click that somehow felt louder than everything he had said. Grant glanced at it, then at her face, expecting tears or pleading, or at least one final attempt to make him reconsider. But Naomi only rose from the table, crossed the room, and picked up a small black notebook from the marble console by the door. He had seen that notebook for years and never once asked what was in it. To him, it was one more quiet thing that belonged to her. She lifted her coat, rested her hand on the brass handle, and paused just long enough to say, "One day, Grant, you will wish you had asked who I really was." Then she walked out into the hallway without looking back, leaving him alone with a skyline full of lights, a glass table full of signatures, and the first mistake of his life that money would not be able to undo. Grant Whitmore stood alone in the penthouse long after the door had closed behind Naomi, staring at the ring she had left on the papers as if it were a small inconvenience instead of a verdict. He poured himself a drink he did not want, loosened his tie, and told himself the silence in the room felt cleaner now, more efficient, more suited to the life he had chosen. That was how men like Grant survived their own decisions. They renamed loss as order. By morning, the legal team had the documents. By afternoon, his assistant had removed Naomi from the guest list for an upcoming charity dinner. By evening, her framed photograph was no longer on the console near the elevator. The city moved fast enough to reward people who could pretend nothing sacred had been broken. But Naomi did not move like the city. She moved like someone carrying the last pieces of herself with both hands. She drove south in a rental car with 2 suitcases in the trunk, a wool coat folded beside her, and the small black notebook resting on the passenger seat, as if it were the only thing in the world that could still recognize her. Rain chased the windshield through New Jersey. By the time she crossed into Virginia, the sky had cleared into a pale silver blue. She kept both hands on the wheel, her jaw set, her breathing even. She did not call friends to explain. She did not post photographs about new beginnings. She did not rehearse speeches in case anyone asked what happened. She only drove, mile after mile, until the hard glitter of Manhattan was behind her and the roads opened into long stretches of pine, gas stations, and tired billboards promising coffee, clean rooms, and second chances. Atlanta welcomed her without ceremony. She rented a small apartment above a flower shop on a quiet street lined with old brick buildings and maple trees. The floors creaked. The water heater complained. The kitchen window looked out over an alley where delivery trucks backed in before sunrise. It was nothing like the penthouse she had left, and that was exactly why she chose it. There was no marble, no polished silver, no staff moving softly in the background to maintain a life that had never truly belonged to her. There was only a wooden table, a lamp with a crooked shade, and enough room for truth. On the first night, Naomi opened the black notebook. Inside were years of handwritten observations, market patterns, supply chain warnings, cost forecasts, and strategic corrections, all the thoughts she had once offered carefully, quietly, and often without credit. Grant had seen the finished success and assumed it came from his own brilliance. He had never noticed the woman across the room tracking every weakness before it became public. Naomi ran her fingers over the pages, then set the notebook beside her laptop and began again. She took freelance consulting work that paid by the hour and demanded twice the effort. She reviewed failing operations for regional companies no one in New York would have noticed. She worked at dawn with coffee gone cold beside her, and at midnight with spreadsheets glowing across her face in the dark. The woman Grant had dismissed as too quiet built her new life without applause, one solved problem at a time. Months passed, then a year, then two. Her name began to move through private conversations first, then executive boardrooms, then industry circles. There was talk of a strategist in Atlanta who could walk into a broken company and leave it standing taller than before. Most people said she was disciplined. A few said she was brilliant. None of them knew that every success began with the same simple truth Naomi had carried out of that penthouse the night her marriage ended. She had never been too small for his world. His world had simply been too blind to see her. By the third year, Naomi Carter had become the kind of name people lowered their voices for in executive hallways. Not because she chased attention, but because results had a way of making noise without asking permission. Cartervale Strategy had grown from a one-woman operation at a creaking apartment table into a firm with glass offices in Midtown Atlanta, a small team of analysts who trusted her completely, and a reputation for rescuing companies that had already been written off by louder men with sharper suits. She still arrived before sunrise most mornings, still carried the same black notebook in her leather tote, and still paused for exactly 3 seconds before every major decision, as if she were listening to something deeper than profit. Across the country, Grant Whitmore had begun to notice a new irritation pressing against the edges of his otherwise controlled life. Whitmore Global was still powerful, still polished, still photographed in the right magazines under the right lighting, but the numbers underneath the surface had started to shift in ways he did not like. A shipping delay in California had become a supplier dispute in Texas. A rushed expansion in Arizona had strained cash flow. A technology integration he had approved 6 months earlier was not performing the way his team had promised it would. Nothing had collapsed yet, but Grant knew the language of weakness when it first entered a room. It moved quietly. It hid behind confidence. It waited for arrogance to do the rest. One Tuesday morning, inside a conference room lined with smoked glass and framed awards, his chief financial officer placed a slim folder in front of him and said, "There is one firm I think can stabilize this before the board starts asking harder questions." Grant did not look up right away. "Then call them." The chief financial officer hesitated just long enough to be noticed. "They are not easy to get," he said. "The founder chooses the clients personally." Grant lifted the folder, already annoyed by the implication that anyone could afford to be selective with him. On the first page was a simple black logo and a name he had seen twice already in trade reports and once in a private investor memo. Cartervale Strategy. Beneath it, in clean type, were case summaries from Chicago, Charlotte, and Dallas, each one showing the same impossible pattern. Broken systems corrected, debt exposure reduced, leadership restructured, growth restored. Grant read the numbers twice. Then his gaze stopped on the signature at the bottom of the executive profile. N. Carter, founder and chief executive officer. There was no photograph, no personal biography worth speaking of, no interviews filled with self-congratulation, just performance, precision, and a waiting list. For reasons he could not explain, the single initial unsettled him more than a full name would have. He closed the folder and tapped it once against the table. "Set the meeting," he said. "We have tried." The chief financial officer replied carefully. She declined twice. The room went still. People rarely declined Grant Whitmore. They postponed, negotiated, admired, rescheduled, and occasionally flattered, but they did not say no. He turned toward the windows where Manhattan rose in steel and winter light and felt, for the first time in a long while, the thin edge of something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly. Not yet. Something closer to resistance. That evening, while the city flashed cold and gold below his office, Grant opened the folder again. He studied the charts, the margins, the clean intelligence running through every decision. Somewhere in Atlanta, a woman he had never met, or thought he had never met, was building order out of failing empires. And without knowing why, Grant found himself staring at the letter N as if it were a door he had seen before in another life, one he had once walked past without bothering to open. The invitation arrived on a heavy cream card edged in silver, the kind reserved for people whose names moved markets before they entered a room. The New York Economic Leadership Summit was hosting its annual gala at the Hudson Meridian, and Whitmore Global was listed among the premier sponsors, which meant Grant had no reason to refuse. He told himself he was attending for visibility, for investors, for the optics of calm in a season of quiet instability. But when his assistant mentioned that one of the keynote speakers would be the founder of Carter Vale Strategy, something in him sharpened. On the night of the event, Manhattan glittered under a hard winter sky, and the hotel ballroom glowed with chandeliers, polished glass, and the low golden light that made powerful people look almost softer than they were. Grant moved through the room with practiced ease, shaking hands, accepting compliments, hearing his own name spoken with the usual respect. Yet his attention kept drifting to the stage, where a wide screen displayed the schedule in elegant lettering. Panel discussions, market forecasts, a leadership award presentation, then the keynote. The room was full by the time the lights dimmed. A hush rolled outward like a tide pulling back from shore. Grant took his seat at a front table, one hand resting near his water glass, his face composed, his mind far less so. The host stepped into the spotlight and began introducing the evening's featured speaker, describing a strategist whose work had restored failing companies across the country, whose discretion was matched only by her precision, whose firm had become the most sought-after name in corporate restructuring. Grant listened, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. Then the host smiled and said, "Please welcome Naomi Carter, founder and chief executive officer of Carter Vale Strategy." For one suspended second, the room seemed to lose its sound. Grant did not move. He did not even breathe. Naomi stepped onto the stage in a black silk gown cut with quiet elegance. Nothing loud, nothing trying too hard, every detail exact. Her hair framed her face in soft waves. Her shoulders were straight. Her expression was calm, self-possessed, untouched by the hundreds of eyes turning toward her. The giant screen behind her lit up with her name in white letters against a midnight background, and the applause rose all at once, surrounding her like weather. Grant felt it in his chest before he heard it fully. Naomi. Not N. Carter. Not a stranger from Atlanta. Naomi. The woman who had once stood in his penthouse under warm light and signed away his last chance to know her. She reached the podium and thanked the audience in a voice that had not changed, still steady, still low, still carrying more force than men often recognized until it was too late. Then she began to speak about broken systems, hidden waste, leadership failures disguised as confidence, and the cost of ignoring the people who saw problems before anyone else. Her words were clean and measured, but every sentence seemed to land somewhere deeper than the room intended. Grant stared at her as the years rearranged themselves in brutal silence. The dinner parties where she had said little while noticing everything. The mornings she had lingered over business headlines he assumed she barely understood. The moments he had mistaken stillness for emptiness. Around him, executives took notes. Investors nodded. A senator at the next table leaned forward with open admiration. Naomi was not merely holding the room. She was commanding it without ever raising her voice. And as the applause broke over her again at the end of her keynote, Grant Whitmore understood, with the cold clarity of a man finally looking at his own reflection in unforgiving light, that the woman he had dismissed as too quiet had never been standing in his shadow at all. He had been standing in front of her brilliance, blocking himself from the truth. Grant did not follow Naomi when the applause ended. For the first time in years, instinct did not help him. It only left him seated beneath the warm ballroom lights, one hand still around a water glass gone untouched. While the room surged toward her with admiration, he could not interrupt. Men who once circled him for access were now waiting their turn to shake Naomi's hand. Women who built policy, investment groups, and national campaigns leaned in when she spoke. She did not rush. She did not perform gratitude. She moved through the crowd with that same measured calm he used to think meant she lacked ambition. Now he understood it meant she had never needed noise to prove authority. He rose only when the room began shifting toward dessert and private conversations. The orchestra in the corner softened into piano. Crystal clinked. Servers crossed the carpet like shadows in black and white. Grant stepped away from his table and into the corridor outside the ballroom, needing colder air than the room could offer. The hallway was quiet, lined with mirrors, bronze sconces, and framed black and white photographs of old Manhattan winters. He had barely reached the end of it when he heard a familiar voice behind him. "You look like you have seen a ghost." He turned to find Daniel Reeves, Whitmore Global's former chief financial officer, standing near the wall with a champagne flute in one hand and the expression of a man who had spent years noticing what other people missed. Daniel had retired 18 months earlier, but he still carried the same dry intelligence that once made board members nervous. Grant gave a humorless breath. "You knew?" Daniel glanced back toward the ballroom doors, where the applause had started again for someone else. "I suspected the moment I saw the name on the summit schedule," he said. "Then I saw her walk on stage, and suspicion became certainty." Grant stared at him. "Why did nobody tell me?" Daniel's face did not harden. It did something worse. It turned patient. "Because nobody believed you had ever really looked at her." The words landed cleanly, with no room to argue. Grant said nothing. Daniel took a slow sip before continuing. "Do you remember the Memphis distribution crisis 7 years ago? The quarter everyone praised you for saving." Grant nodded once. He remembered the headlines, the board approval, the calls congratulating him for decisive leadership. Daniel held his gaze. Naomi found the flaw in that model before anyone else. She mapped the bottleneck, the labor risk, the vendor exposure, all of it. She sent over the notes after dinner one night. You walked into the boardroom the next morning and presented the answer like it arrived in a flash of instinct. A dull pressure tightened beneath Grant's ribs. Daniel did not stop. "And the Denver acquisition you almost overpaid for?" She flagged the debt load buried in the secondary filings. "The Texas expansion plan you reshaped at the last minute?" That was her question too. Naomi had a way of seeing the weak scene before the whole wall split open. "I told you more than once to listen," when she spoke. Grant searched his memory with sudden desperation, and what rose up was not a single speech or dramatic moment, but smaller things he had dismissed because they came wrapped in softness. Naomi standing in the kitchen with financial pages folded beneath her arm. Naomi asking one precise question at midnight while he checked emails. Naomi pausing by his office door, beginning a thought, then stepping back when his attention moved elsewhere. Daniel lowered his voice. "You thought she was standing beside power. She was helping build it." The corridor seemed to narrow around Grant then, the golden light turning thin and distant. Inside the ballroom, laughter drifted through the closed doors. Outside, beyond the tall windows at the end of the hall, snow had begun to fall over the city in slow white silence. Grant looked through the glass and saw, with a clarity that made him feel almost unsteady, that his worst mistake had not been leaving Naomi. It had been living beside greatness and calling it invisible until someone else taught the world how to see it. By Monday morning, the glow of the gala had already given way to consequence. In the 39th floor boardroom at Whitmore Global, the air felt too warm, the coffee too bitter, the silence too careful. A red column of numbers glowed across the presentation screen, while senior executives avoided looking directly at Grant. What had begun as a strained integration and a handful of delayed shipments had now unfolded into something larger, messier, and harder to hide. A major logistics partner was threatening to walk. 2 regional lenders were reviewing their exposure. If the next quarter opened with the wrong signal, the market would not punish Grant alone. It would hit warehouses, drivers, office staff, pension accounts, and every smaller company tied to Whitmore Global's contracts. Grant sat at the head of the table with both hands clasped, listening as the general counsel explained risk, as the operations chief blamed timing, as the head of strategy used polished language to describe failure without ever naming it. Then the chief financial officer placed a familiar black folder on the table. Carter Vale Strategy. No one spoke for a moment. Everyone in the room understood what it meant now. Grant opened the folder and saw a short message from Naomi's office. Her firm would review the case under strict conditions. Full autonomy. No public spin. No interference from legacy leadership. No selective disclosure. If engaged, Carter Vale would protect operational continuity and employee stability first. The company's image would come second. Grant read the message twice, and for the first time in years, he felt the sharp discomfort of standing on the wrong side of terms he could not negotiate away. "She is not doing this for me," he said quietly, almost to himself. No one answered, because no one needed to. 3 days later, Naomi entered Whitmore Global Headquarters through the same revolving doors she had once passed through as someone people barely noticed. Now conversations paused when she walked by. Her charcoal coat fell in one clean line to the knee. Her black notebook rested beneath one arm. 2 analysts from Carter Vale followed behind her, carrying laptops and binders. But it was Naomi who shifted the temperature of the room. Not because she was dramatic, because she was exact. Grant met her in the executive conference room, where winter light stretched pale across the glass table. For a second, the memory of another table in another tower crossed between them like a shadow, but Naomi did not let the moment linger. She set down her notebook, opened it, and began. Her voice was level, her eyes clear, her attention fixed on the system rather than the man at the end of it. She outlined every fracture with calm precision. Overextended expansion, poor vendor discipline, leadership filtered through ego instead of data, hidden dependency risks no one had corrected because the right questions had not been welcomed early enough. No insult ever could have wounded Grant as deeply as her restraint did. She did not humiliate him. She simply showed the truth in full light. By the time she finished, the room had gone completely still. "Can you save it?" one board member asked, his voice thinner than he intended. Naomi closed the notebook softly. "I can stabilize it," she said. "But let us be clear. I am not here to rescue pride. I am here because thousands of people who never chose these decisions will pay for them if this company falls the wrong way." Her gaze shifted briefly to Grant then, not with anger, not even with satisfaction, but with something much steadier than either. "Boundary. I will protect the workers, the suppliers, and the families attached to this machine," she said. Whether leadership deserves that protection is a separate question. No one challenged her. No one could. Grant looked at her across the cold shine of the table and understood the final shape of the reversal. Years ago, he had believed power meant deciding who was valuable. Now the only reason his empire still had a chance to stand was the woman he once dismissed, the woman who had every reason to let him fall, and still chose compassion over revenge because her character had always been larger than his understanding of it. Over the next 6 weeks, Whitmore Global did not become beautiful, but it became steady. Under Naomi's leadership, waste was stripped away, fragile contracts were renegotiated, weak reporting lines were rebuilt, and the constant low-grade panic that had haunted the executive floors began to thin out like fog under morning sun. She moved through the company with disciplined calm, never loud, never theatrical, never once confusing authority with performance. Warehouse managers trusted her because she listened before she spoke. Mid-level staff respected her because she remembered names, timelines, and the cost of every delayed decision on ordinary households far from Manhattan glass. Even the board, which had first greeted her with the cautious politeness reserved for outsiders, now waited for her assessments with the concentration of people who had learned that truth sounded different in her voice. Grant watched all of it from a distance that was partly professional and partly deserved. He attended the briefings. He signed what needed signing. He answered the questions Naomi placed before him without trying to regain the upper hand. Some nights, long after most floors had gone dark, he would stand at the window of his office and see the lights still burning in the temporary workspace Carter Vale had taken over down the hall. Through the glass, Naomi would be bent over reports with her notebook open beside her, one hand at her temple, her face lit by screen glow and city light. She looked nothing like the woman he had once misunderstood, and yet, in the quietest way, she looked exactly the same. The difference was not who she had become. The difference was that the world had finally stopped asking her to shrink. On a cold Thursday evening in February, the final phase of the stabilization plan closed ahead of schedule. The lenders held. The logistics partner renewed. Layoffs that once seemed inevitable were avoided. 1,000 quiet disasters were prevented, which meant no headline would ever fully capture what Naomi had done. But the industry noticed anyway. 2 weeks later, at the National Business Renewal Awards in Washington, District of Columbia, Naomi Carter was named Strategic Leader of the Year for transforming failing systems without sacrificing the people caught inside them. Grant attended because Whitmore Global had been listed among the case studies in the program, though he suspected even before he arrived that the night would not belong to his company. The ballroom was different from New York, less glittering, more formal, with blue light washing the stage and round tables dressed in white linen and silver. When Naomi's name was announced, the applause began before she even rose from her seat. It spread fast and full, people standing almost instinctively, not because ceremony demanded it, but because respect did. Grant remained seated for half a heartbeat, stunned by the force of it, then stood with everyone else. From across the room, he watched Naomi walk toward the stage in an ivory gown that caught the light without needing sparkle, her posture composed, her expression thoughtful rather than triumphant. She accepted the award with both hands and stood at the microphone while the room settled into silence. Sustainable leadership is not proven by how much power a person can hold, she said. It is proven by how many people are still standing because someone chose responsibility over ego. No one in the room missed the line, though she offered it without bitterness. Grant felt it move through him anyway, clean and undeniable. When the applause rose again, louder than before, he clapped until his palms stung. And in that bright formal room, surrounded by senators, founders, and men who had spent their lives being listened to, Grant Whitmore faced the simplest and most humbling truth of his adult life. The strongest person he had ever known was the quiet black woman he once thought would never matter beyond his name. Now the whole country was speaking hers. After the ceremony, the ballroom slowly dissolved into smaller circles of influence, laughter, and polished congratulations, but Grant Whitmore did not move toward any of them. He watched Naomi from across the room as people stopped her one by one, senators, founders, nonprofit leaders, journalists, all of them asking for a few seconds of her time, and she gave each person the same thing she had always given the world when she chose to engage with it: full attention, quiet dignity, and not 1 ounce of unnecessary performance. When she finally stepped away from the crowd, she did not head for the cameras near the stage or the private lounge where the highest donors had gathered. She slipped into a side corridor lined with tall windows and soft blue carpet, the kind of hotel hallway designed for people who needed a moment to breathe between public versions of themselves. Grant followed at a measured distance, not wanting to startle her, not wanting to look like a man chasing a memory he had not earned. Naomi heard his footsteps before he spoke. She stopped near the window at the end of the hall where the lights of Washington, District of Columbia shimmered against the dark glass, and she turned with one hand resting lightly against the award she still carried. For a second neither of them said anything. The silence between them no longer felt like the old silence from their marriage, the one crowded with assumptions and neglect. This one was cleaner, harder, honest. Grant stood a few feet away, his tuxedo jacket still buttoned, his expression stripped of the polished ease he used to wear like a second skin. "Naomi," he said, and her name sounded different in his mouth now, less like something he once possessed, and more like something he had learned to say carefully. "I am not here to ask for anything." She held his gaze, but did not rescue him from the moment. Grant swallowed once. "I need to say this while I still have the courage to say it plainly. I was wrong about you. Not just in the end. From the beginning. I mistook your quiet for absence. I mistook your grace for weakness. I stood beside you for years and only valued what was loud enough to flatter me." Naomi did not interrupt. The hallway lights cast a soft gold edge along her face, and the city beyond the glass looked far away, as though the whole world had stepped back to hear what would happen next. Grant continued, his voice lower now. "I did not only fail to love you well. I failed to see you. And because I failed to see you, I took from you in ways I did not even understand at the time. Credit, space, respect. The simple dignity of being recognized for who you were. He let out a slow breath that seemed to cost him something. I am sorry. Naomi looked down briefly at the award in her hands, then back at him. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost gentle, but there was steel beneath it. That is the first true thing you have ever said to me without trying to control what came after. Grant accepted the words without flinching. She stepped closer to the window, turning slightly so that the city lights touched the curve of her cheek. Do you know what hurt the most? She asked. It was not the divorce. It was not even the sentence you said that night. It was that I had spent years making myself smaller so the marriage would feel easier for you to carry, and even then, you called me too small. Grant lowered his eyes. Naomi did not sound angry. That was what made the truth so sharp. I do not hate you, she said. I stopped needing that a long time ago. But understanding me now does not give you access to me now. He nodded once, slowly, as if each word were settling into the part of him that had once resisted every correction. I know, he said. And for the first time, Naomi believed him. She offered no promise, no softened ending, no invitation to revisit what had already been buried by time and consequence. She simply held his gaze for one quiet moment longer, then said, There is a difference between regret and change, Grant. Learn it. With that, she turned and walked down the corridor toward the waiting elevator, carrying her award in one hand and her hard-won peace in the other, while Grant remained by the window, watching the reflection of the woman he had lost move farther away until the doors opened, closed, and left him alone with the truth he could no longer outrun. Spring arrived in New York by degrees, softening the sharp edges of winter glass and washing the city in a thinner, kinder light. But Grant Whitmore had learned by then that seasons did not reverse what truth had already exposed. Whitmore Global survived, though not in the shape it once held. The company was smaller now, leaner, stripped of the excess that had once made it look invincible while quietly making it fragile. Board oversight had tightened. Expansion had slowed. The old confidence that used to move through the executive floors like perfume had been replaced by something less glamorous and far more necessary. Humility. Grant kept working, because work was the only honest thing left for him to do. He no longer confused being respected with being right. He no longer mistook silence in a room for agreement. And yet, on certain evenings, when the city lights came on one building at a time and his office windows turned into mirrors, he would catch his own reflection and remember a woman who had once stood in rooms like that and been underestimated by everyone except herself. In Atlanta, Naomi Carter did not spend much time looking back. Cartervale Strategy had outgrown its first office and moved into a new headquarters of steel, warm oak, and glass that opened toward the skyline. The black notebook still traveled with her everywhere, though its pages were now joined by binders, legal drafts, market maps, and acquisition models. She had become the person companies called when they needed more than advice. They called when they needed a future. So when a strategic asset long tied to Whitmore Global came onto the market, a logistics platform with national reach and the potential to reshape several industries at once, Naomi did not hesitate. She studied the numbers. She saw the value. She made her offer through clean channels and quiet confidence, the way she did everything that mattered. The final meeting took place in Lower Manhattan on a bright April afternoon inside a law office overlooking the river. The conference room smelled faintly of paper, polished wood, and fresh coffee. Sunlight lay across the table in pale gold rectangles. Attorneys reviewed the last pages. Advisors murmured over closing language. Naomi sat at the center in a tailored black suit, her posture composed, one hand resting near her pen, the other over the familiar edge of the notebook. Across the table, representing the seller's side, Grant watched the process unfold with a stillness that no longer came from pride. The deal was sound. The valuation was fair. The future belonged, unmistakably, to her. When the final documents were placed before Naomi, the room grew quiet in that special way rooms do when everyone senses they are standing near a moment bigger than business. She signed her name in one fluid motion. Naomi Carter. Not Naomi Whitmore. Not an echo of someone else's world. Only herself, fully visible, fully chosen. Cameras were not allowed in the room, but the glass wall at her side reflected the new logo already prepared for release on the market screens downstairs. Cartervale Strategic Holdings. Grant saw the reflection before anyone spoke it aloud. White letters suspended. In glass. Her name, her company, her future, shining back at the city that had once taught him to measure people by volume and spectacle. When the meeting ended, people rose, shook hands, and gathered folders. Naomi thanked the legal team, exchanged a few final words with her advisors, and turned toward the door. Grant stepped aside to let her pass. For a moment, she paused beside him. No bitterness crossed her face. No triumph either. Only peace, earned the long way. He looked at her and understood at last that this had never been a story about whether she would return to him. It had always been a story about whether she would return to herself. Naomi gave him a small, courteous nod, then walked out beneath her own name, into a hallway full of light. Grant remained where he was, watching her reflection disappear from the glass, and knew with a certainty deeper than regret that the quiet woman he had once dismissed had not come back to be loved by him. She had risen to become proof that she never needed his permission to matter.